I started in Vienna, and at the IAEA and the UN, what used to be called the UN Drug Control Program. And they had a big library at the Vienna International Center, very nice library. And so every so often in my free time I would go there and just page through some of the publications that they had. And they had a magazine back then, a quarterly journal that was called Choices. And I would page through that every so often, and very interesting issues, very diverse. And only later on did I appreciate that this was UNDP's quarterly flagship publication back then. I don't think they publish it anymore. But I think the title for that journal is very significant in the context of this year's report, Choices. This year's report is all about choices. It's about choices that the future generations of this world will have. It's about the choices that our current generation have in different parts of the world. And I think what I'll talk very briefly about is merging these two concepts. Sustainability, which is really an attempt to safeguard the choices of future generations by being more responsible today in how we consume and produce. And it's also about choices for today, the poor, the disadvantaged in different parts of the world, that because of where they're born, because of their religion, because of their ethnicity, because of which part of the world, north or south, that they come from, face certain constraints on the choices that they have today. What are the policy issues, the policy decisions that governments can take to have what we call a win-win situation, where we're not only helping future generations in expanding the choices that they will have, but simultaneously making this world that we live in today a fairer place where those disadvantaged will have more choices today. And just to clarify the policy dilemmas that many governments face today, there are really, and really the theme of this year's report, I would like to look at the very top box, expand access to renewable energy. This is what we call a win-win situation. It's an attempt to safeguard and expand the choices that people in future generations will have in a world that is not faced by environmental disasters. It's also helping the current generation of poor and disadvantaged to live their lives in a way that's not always possible when they do not have access to basic fuels. Now, if you look at the next box, number 2, restricting access to public forests, that's a very good way to protect future generations and expand the choices that they will have. But it does very little for today's poor and disadvantaged that might rely on that very same forest habitat to live their lives. Then you have number 3, which is a lose-lose situation. It helps very few people tomorrow, and it helps only a very limited privileged group today, those who have automobiles, and very often those that are living in Western wealthy countries, because that's where you see most common subsidies to gasoline consumption. And then you see number 4, which is focusing very much on being fair to today's world, okay? Subsidizing coal in developing countries, providing electricity for the poor, very good, but it does very little thinking for tomorrow. These are the dilemmas that governments and policymakers, like the Honorable Minister today, are facing, and it's not an easy dilemma to bridge. What I'm going to do now is go through some of the major messages of this year's report. The first one I've just mentioned to you. It's this linking between sustainability and equity. That's the main message of this year's report. But within that message, there are 3 other sub-messages that I'm going to talk to you about. Last year's report, let me set the context first, emphasized the tremendous progress in human development since the 1990s. 1990 was the first year of the Human Development Report. It was a time when the Washington Consensus was very prominent, focus on income generation and growth. Human Development Report was very successful in changing the whole debate. It's growth with a human face. That was one of the early mottos. Now, what they found in last year's report was that when it comes to education and health, poorer countries have very much made big steps towards catching up with the rich countries. Inequality at the global level when it comes to health and education has diminished. That's a good thing. What hasn't diminished is income inequality. And, as my good colleague Subai mentioned, inequality within countries. Very interesting phenomenon globally. Less inequality between countries, more inequality within countries. But the message from this one slide I'd like to emphasize is there has been progress. There's been progress over the last 20 years. And last year's Human Development Report looked all the way back to 1970 and said between 1970 and 2010, there has been considerable progress in bridging the education and health gap between wealthy and poor countries. Now, if we continue this extrapolation into 2050, what are some of the likely scenarios that we can expect? Well, if we continue to make this progress in human development, you can see the graphs. The very rich countries, the high human development index countries are on the top line, and the rest are on the bottom. And you can see that that bottom line has a more vertical angle. We can expect continued progress in human development. That's without any environmental impact, which of course is unfortunately completely unrealistic. If we take account of a medium range of environmental impact for the next 40 years, we can see that human development doesn't progress as much as it would otherwise. And the progress in the poorer countries is the impact is much stronger in the lower group. If we take into account what we would call an environmental disaster scenario, okay, which is not a worst case scenario, it's just taking into account and expecting the possibility of environmental disaster, we can expect all of the human development gains for the next 40 years to be eliminated. One of the major messages of this report is environmental threats hurt the poorest the most. Global temperatures now, today, average 0.75 degrees Celsius higher than at the beginning of the 20th century, and the rate of change has accelerated. The main cause, human activity, particularly burning fossil fuels, cutting forests, and manufacturing cement, all of which increase carbon dioxide emissions. Rising sea levels, impact on rainfall. In fact, if you look at the actual the research on rainfall, you can see that whereas there has been compared to the 1950s to 80s, the last decade has been one in which rainfall has started to decrease. In the high human development countries, 1.49 millimeters per month less, but much more in the lower human development countries. There is less rain falling there. And most affected is sub-Saharan Africa. A few other examples that we're anticipating. This is actually the variability. So there's actually even less predictability in the rainfall, not just the absolute levels. Bangladesh, with a 0.5 meter rise in sea level, which is not going beyond the realm of possibility, will lose 11% of its land in the next 40 years, affecting 15 million people. Cairo, a city that we hear a lot about in the last few months, rising sea levels could displace more than 14 million Egyptians as increased salination of the Nile reduce irrigated land for agriculture. These are trends that we're already seeing and that we can expect to continue into the next decades unless major actions are taken today. But it's not only the long-term forecasts that poor countries need to worry about. It's today. Again, a key message is not only looking deep into the future, but what's happening today. And it's very clear that poor people today, as we all know, have a rough running of it as well. This report describes something called the double burden of the poor. They not only have to face a world in the future which is much more grim for their lives, but they have a daily existence which is much more difficult, which creates certain deprivations. Nearly 90% of the poor in today's world lack access to modern cooking fuels.